There's a snapshot most people have bypassed, never truly pausing to absorb. It was June of 2004, on the steps of the United States Capitol. An 82-year-old woman, petite and slightly bowed, stood by herself next to a flag-draped coffin. Dignitaries, military leaders, the press, all eyes were on her. Yet she seemed adrift, miles away from the present scene, as if the clamor of existence had hushed, leaving only the solemn presence of the casket. This woman was Nancy Reagan, and the man within that final resting place was, by her own admission, the sole impetus for her daily existence. The public generally recalls her polished image, the signature red attire, the whispers of astrological influence, the speculation about her power behind the scenes. However, far fewer comprehend the realities that unfolded post-White House, the profound personal cost and the sheer fortitude required to persevere after his passing. This is that narrative. Segment 9 delves into Queen Nancy, the figure Washington both admired and disparaged. To grasp the conclusion, one must first understand the genesis. Nancy Reagan, born Anne Frances Robbins, entered the world in New York City on July 6, 1921. Her father was a purveyor of pre-owned automobiles, her mother a stage performer. The parental union dissolved not long after her birth, and for her formative 6 years, she was raised by an aunt and uncle in Maryland, while her mother pursued her theatrical ambitions. This early chapter, characterized by love, yet a pervasive sense of being not quite anchored, undoubtedly left its imprint. Stability finally arrived in 1929 when her mother wed Loyal Davis, a distinguished neurosurgeon in Chicago. He formally adopted her, bestowing his surname and her adoration. She pursued her studies at Smith College, emulated her mother's acting aspirations, and ultimately secured a 7-year contract with MGM in Hollywood. By then known as Nancy Davis, she established herself as a capable and quietly driven actress with a modest career. Her life's trajectory veered unexpectedly when, in 1951, she encountered Ronald Reagan, then the president of the Screen Actors Guild. Their union followed the subsequent year, a discreet ceremony on March 4, 1952, graced by the presence of only their close companions, William Holden and Ardis Ankerson, as witnesses. She was 30 years of age, he 41. Reagan had been previously married to actress Jane Wyman, with whom he had 2 children, Maureen and an adopted son, Michael. Together, Ronald and Nancy welcomed 2 more children, Patricia, who would later adopt the moniker Patty Davis, and Ron. Those who knew her intimately during that era attest that from the outset, the marriage became her all-encompassing focus. Her life revolved around his timetable, his requirements, and his ambitions. When he transitioned into public service in California, culminating in his governorship win in 1966, she accompanied him, experiencing her inaugural, stark encounter with the demands of public life. Her adoring gaze at his speeches, the way she seemed oblivious to anyone else in the room, drew public derision. The press christened it the gaze, typically with unflattering commentary. She remained undeterred. Upon Ronald Reagan's inauguration as the 40th President of the United States on January 20, 1981, Nancy Reagan entered the White House with a resolute purpose: to safeguard Ronnie, to ensure his well-being, and to vet those around him for their suitability. All else was secondary. However, Washington perceived matters differently. Within weeks, criticism surfaced. She had commissioned a new set of 4,732 pieces of china for the White House, at a cost of approximately $29,000, funded by private contributions, not public funds. Yet the optics were calamitous. The nation was grappling with a recession, and the Reagan administration was implementing cuts to federal programs, while the new First Lady was procuring custom china adorned with a gold rim and a crimson presidential seal. The moniker Queen Nancy was quickly bestowed. She also oversaw a significant refurbishment of the White House's private quarters, accepted loans of lavish designer gowns from prominent fashion houses, and hosted opulent state dinners, 56 over 8 years, that exuded a Hollywood flair unseen in Washington for decades. Supporters lauded her for restoring the elegance of the Kennedy era, while critics deemed her entirely out of touch. She herself admitted to being deeply wounded by the media's portrayal. Those initial months, already overshadowed by an event that would irrevocably alter their lives, were what she later termed a lost year. For on March 30th, 1981, a mere 69 days into President Reagan's term, a young man named John Hinckley Jr. emerged from a crowd outside the Washington Hilton Hotel and discharged 6 shots. One bullet struck the president in the chest, narrowly missing his heart by less than an inch. A Secret Service agent, a police officer, and the White House press secretary were also injured. Nancy was at the White House when the distressing news arrived. Initially, she was informed that her husband had not been hit. However, an instinct compelled her to press for further details. Upon repeating her inquiry, she was apprised of the truth. She rushed to the hospital. Ronald Reagan, ever the charming figure, reportedly quipped to her, in anticipation of his surgery, something to the effect of hoping she knew he had forgotten to duck, an attempt to elicit a smile. Her reaction was far from mirthful. She remained at his bedside for 13 days. Subsequently, nothing would ever be quite the same for Nancy Reagan. From that moment onward, she described existing in a perpetual state of heightened anxiety. Every time Ronald Reagan ventured outdoors into public spaces or faced cameras, she held her breath. Each public engagement felt like a perilous gamble. In her desperation to find solace, a means of exerting even a modicum of control over the uncontrollable, she turned to an acquaintance from their Hollywood days, an astrologer named Joan Quigley. The repercussions of that decision, for the presidency, for history, and ultimately for Nancy herself, form a part of this narrative rarely fully disclosed. Segment 8 explores The Woman in San Francisco, the secret that the White House guarded. Joan Quigley was no mere eccentric. She was a graduate of Vassar College, a published author, and a prominent San Francisco socialite who had made television appearances. Their initial encounter predated this period, occurring on Mike Douglas's talk show. Astrology was not entirely foreign to the Reagans. Both had consulted their horoscopes since their Hollywood careers. However, the engagement that followed the assassination attempt marked a distinct departure. Nancy began contacting Quigley with regularity, relaying President Reagan's upcoming schedule. Quigley, in turn, would consult her charts, examining planetary alignments and identifying auspicious or inauspicious dates. Nancy would then leverage this information to advocate for schedule modifications. Travel itineraries were altered, press conferences were postponed, and departure times were shifted. For years, this arrangement remained unknown to anyone outside a very select inner circle. White House aides received directives regarding the president's schedule without any explanation. Some grew exasperated, yet they complied. Then arrived Ronald Reagan. Reagan, unrelated to the president, transitioned from Wall Street, where he had led Merrill Lynch. He was appointed as Treasury Secretary during Ronald Reagan's first term. In 1985, he exchanged roles with Chief of Staff James Baker. Reagan was assertive, meticulously organized, and possessed a strong sense of his own authority. From the moment he assumed the position of Chief of Staff, he found himself in a covert conflict with the First Lady. She would contact him repeatedly, offering guidance on scheduling matters, expressing concerns about specific aids or policies, and conveying her assessment of what was beneficial for Ronnie and what was not. Reagan found this immensely vexing. He later remarked that he felt he had become Chief of Staff to the president's wife, not the president himself. The breaking point arrived with the Iran-Contra affair. In late 1986, it surfaced that members of the Reagan administration had covertly facilitated arms sales to Iran, a nation under an arms embargo, and had subsequently channeled the proceeds to Nicaraguan rebels known as the Contras. This became one of the most significant political scandals of the Reagan presidency. As the crisis unfolded, Nancy concluded that Donald Reagan had failed her husband, that he had permitted such chaos to occur on his watch, and that he was ill-equipped to manage the ensuing fallout. She advocated for his dismissal. Reagan resisted. For months, both parties engaged in strategic leaks of unfavorable stories to the press. The animosity escalated into a public and acrimonious dispute. In February 1987, Reagan resigned, or was effectively ousted, depending on the account one credits. His departure was not without consequence. In 1988, as the Reagan presidency neared its conclusion, Reagan published a memoir. In it, he detailed the astrological consultations with extraordinary specificity. He asserted that virtually every significant action and decision made during his tenure as Chief of Staff had been pre-approved by a woman in San Francisco who prepared horoscopes to ensure favorable planetary alignments. At the time of writing, he was unaware of her identity, though Time magazine promptly identified her as Quigley. The revelation detonated like a bomb. The White House acknowledged Nancy's consultations with an astrologer, while simultaneously asserting that no policy decisions had ever been predicated upon such advice. Ronald Reagan unequivocally stated that astrology had never influenced his decisions. In her 1989 memoir, Nancy Reagan acknowledged the practice but disputed its characterization, framing it not as superstition but as a desperate effort to safeguard her husband's life after he had survived an assassination attempt. She wrote that she was employing every conceivable measure to protect him, expressing her inability to comprehend the experience of having one's husband shot and nearly killed, only to then have him routinely enter large crowds, any one of whom could be armed. Her fear was valid. The enduring question remains whether her methods were appropriate. This debate has never been conclusively resolved. What is beyond dispute is this: the disclosure fundamentally altered historical perceptions of Nancy Reagan's role in the White House. She was no longer perceived merely as an elegant hostess or a devoted spouse, but as an individual who had operated discreetly within the very operational core of the presidency. And before long, those same attributes, her protectiveness, her unyielding loyalty, her readiness to confront challenges, would be tested in ways no astrologer could have foreseen. However, before that chapter unfolded, the Reagans were destined to depart Washington. What awaited them back in California would prove to be the most tranquil, yet profoundly devastating period of their lives, shaping how Nancy Reagan would ultimately be remembered. Segment 7, The Long Goodbye, chronicles Alzheimer's and the disappearing man. In January of 1989, Ronald and Nancy Reagan returned to California. Generous friends had assisted them in acquiring a residence on St. Cloud Road in the affluent Bel Air neighborhood of Los Angeles. They also made excursions to Rancho del Cielo, their cherished ranch nestled in the hills above Santa Barbara, a place where Ronald relished horseback riding, clearing brush, and feeling a sense of personal fulfillment. From an external viewpoint, those initial years appeared to be a pleasant retirement. He delivered speeches, they attended events. She continued her anti-drug advocacy through the Nancy Reagan Foundation. On the surface, life seemed manageable, but Nancy had been observing her husband for years with the discerning eye of someone perpetually attuned to subtle changes. And sometime in the early 1990s, she began to notice concerning patterns. He exhibited a greater frequency of forgetting names than usual, repeated himself, and sometimes struggled with rudimentary tasks. She had always recognized his occasional forgetfulness in social settings, a tendency he had long masked with wit and effortless charm. However, this was different. Something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. In 1994, Ronald Reagan delivered what would be his final public address at a gathering in Washington commemorating his 83rd birthday. He delivered his remarks to an appreciative audience, as was customary. Yet, upon their return to their hotel suite afterward, he paused, surveyed his surroundings, and confessed his disorientation regarding his location. Shortly thereafter, Nancy sought medical counsel at the Mayo Clinic. When the physicians presented their findings, they identified the condition as Alzheimer's disease. For Nancy, this was a prognosis she had already been psychologically preparing for. By the time one actively seeks answers, a prior awareness often signals that something is gravely amiss. On November 5, 1994, Ronald Reagan penned a letter to the American people in his still steady handwriting, announcing his commencement of a journey into the twilight of his life. It was an extraordinary act of public candor. Seldom had public figures, particularly those in such prominent positions, spoken so openly about an Alzheimer's diagnosis. For Nancy, the ensuing journey surpassed all her prior imaginings. The initial years were almost bearable. Ronald continued his walks, maintained his meticulous grooming, offered smiles to all he encountered, and retained the innate courtesy that had defined him throughout his adult life. Those who saw him during this phase frequently commented on his remarkably preserved appearance. However, beneath this composed exterior, the man Nancy knew, the one who penned her affectionate letters, who brought laughter into her life, who declared her the very reason for his waking, began to recede. There were days when he seemed almost his former self, and other days when he was uncertain of his whereabouts. He would, at times, forget having ever resided in the White House. He could no longer ascertain the current year or even the prevailing season. Nancy shared the same bed with him as the disease advanced, lying beside a man who awoke each morning with a diminishing certainty of her identity. She once confided to a television commentator outside the Reagan Library that Alzheimer's was a more profound ordeal than the assassination attempt, as the latter, while terrifying, had ultimately brought a sense of relief. This was an entirely different form of suffering, a separation occurring while he remained physically present, a gradual effacement of the beloved individual day by day. She termed it the long goodbye. Concurrently, practical losses ensued. Ronald could no longer engage in horseback riding, his solitary, cherished outdoor pursuit. His former Secret Service agent had to gently inform him that it was no longer safe. Reagan reportedly wept, yet graciously told the agent it was acceptable and that he would be fine, a response that was perhaps the most heart-wrenching aspect of it all. Nancy sold the ranch in 1998, deeming it purposeless to retain it. She then embarked on what would become a decade of almost complete dedication, rarely leaving the Bel Air residence, quietly overseeing the staff who assisted in his care, and preserving his dignity with the same ferocity she had once employed to safeguard his public image. In this process, she also discovered a cause she would champion with unwavering conviction. Segment 6. The Battle She Chose addresses stem cells and the confrontation with Washington. Witnessing Ronald Reagan's gradual descent into Alzheimer's evoked a reaction in Nancy Reagan that surprised those who had perceived her solely as the wife of a conservative Republican. It ignited in her a sense of indignation, not directed at the disease itself, as there was no singular target for such an emotion, but at the perception that more could have been accomplished, that scientific solutions existed but were not being pursued, and that political considerations were impeding progress. The focus was embryonic stem cell research. In the early 2000s, there was considerable scientific optimism regarding the potential of stem cells derived from human embryos to eventually offer treatments or even cures for conditions such as Alzheimer's. This research was contentious due to the nature of the embryos involved. In August 2001, President George W. Bush issued an executive order severely restricting federal funding for such research. This decision garnered strong support from religious conservatives within the Republican Party. Nancy Reagan, a Republican First Lady and the daughter of a devout Catholic stepfather, remained indifferent to these considerations. Her sole focus was Ronnie. She commenced public and forceful advocacy for expanded stem cell research. She met with scientists and engaged in quiet yet persistent lobbying of politicians. At a dinner in Washington, she reportedly approached Bush's chief of staff, Andy Card, and urged him directly to reconsider the administration's stance. The administration did not alter its policy. She, however, continued her efforts. She co-founded the Ronald and Nancy Reagan Research Institute with the Alzheimer's Association. She utilized every available platform to argue that the scientific endeavor warranted funding. This was undertaken by a woman in her 80s who was dedicating the majority of her time to full-time caregiving. It represented a remarkable transformation for someone who had for years been characterized as solely interested in fashion and social standing. This advocacy earned her something she had never quite achieved during her White House tenure: genuine and widespread admiration that transcended party lines. Republicans who had applauded the initial policy, Democrats who had once reviled Queen Nancy, and scientists who might never have supported a Reagan candidate found common ground. For a brief, peculiar period, she became a unifying cause. This also placed her at odds with a political party she still considered her own. Her son, Ron, the younger, held more liberal views and had publicly departed from Republican orthodoxy on several issues. Her daughter, Patty Davis, had experienced a protracted estrangement from the family due to political and personal disagreements. Family dynamics had always been intricate. However, on this particular issue, they found a point of consensus. Meanwhile, back at the Bel Air residence, the man for whom they were all campaigning was fading. By 2003, Ronald Reagan rarely ventured outside the house and required constant supervision. Nancy managed his caregivers, oversaw his medical needs, and spent hours each day simply by his side, a presence he might not always have recognized, but one she steadfastly refused to withdraw. Accounts describe her reading to him, sitting quietly near him and holding his hand. In his final months, she seldom left home. She was 82 years old, undertaking this monumental task nearly alone, supported by staff and a small circle of family and friends within a house on St. Cloud Road in Los Angeles. A poignant detail from those final months has remained with individuals who closely followed the story. Ronald Reagan's personal physician, Dr. John Hutton, would later characterize Nancy's devotion during this period as extraordinary, even by the standards of caregiving, a field replete with remarkable dedication. She was present in the mornings and in the evenings. On days when he seemed more lucid, she sat close to him. On days when he appeared to have retreated to an inaccessible realm, she still sat close. In 2000, she published a compilation of his letters to her, titled, "I Love You, Ronnie, The Letters of Ronald Reagan to Nancy Reagan." Reading them, it becomes readily apparent what she mourned, even while he was still alive. The man depicted in those letters was humorous, tender, and effusive in his affection for her. He wrote to her incessantly throughout their marriage. On Valentine's Day, from hotel rooms, from campaign stops, and from the Oval Office. In one letter, he confessed that he was not whole without her, that she represented life itself, and that in her absence, he was merely awaiting her return to resume living. That man who penned those words was gone, or largely absent, years before his heart finally ceased to beat. And then, on the morning of June 5, 2004, after nearly a decade of contending with Alzheimer's disease, Ronald Reagan passed away from pneumonia. He was 93 years of age. And in his very last moments, according to their daughter Patty, he opened his eyes, which had been closed for days, and looked directly at Nancy. His gaze was clear, she recounted, filled with an emotion she had not witnessed in a very long time. Nancy later described this as the most profound gift he could have bestowed upon her. Segment 5. The Week the World Watched and What Came After concludes our exploration. What unfolded next became one of the most meticulously planned and deeply felt public spectacles the United States had witnessed in many years. Nancy Reagan had orchestrated it all. For years her thoughts had turned to this moment, contemplating what Ronnie deserved, the recognition he was owed, and how posterity ought to remember him. She had meticulously arranged every facet of a 7-day state funeral with the same unwavering precision and control that characterized her entire life. The nation observed. Initially, his remains lay in repose at the Reagan Presidential Library. Subsequently, they were transported to Washington, D.C., where he lay in state within the Capitol Rotunda for 34 hours. Hundreds of thousands of individuals filed past. Dignitaries from various nations arrived. Former presidents paid their respects. Margaret Thatcher, despite her own failing health, opted to record a tribute rather than deliver it live, recognizing her inability to maintain composure if speaking in person. Nancy remained at the heart of every proceeding. She stood in the rain at the Capitol, and she sat through the national funeral service held at the Washington National Cathedral. She maintained a composed, controlled, and almost unnervingly stoic demeanor until the very conclusion, at the sunset burial service held at the library in Simi Valley. It was there, finally, that she permitted herself to falter. She pressed her lips to the casket and silently mouthed words that no microphone could capture. She accepted the folded flag, and then, for the first time in 52 years, she returned home alone. The Reagan home remained unchanged. His garments lingered in the closet for some time. The daily routines that had been centered around his care, the presence of caregivers, the medical equipment, and the structured daily schedule vanished. In their wake, only silence remained. Friends and biographers who conversed with Nancy in the ensuing years depicted her as being profoundly solitary, a state that was difficult to witness. Her entire adult existence had been dedicated to one person. He had been the central force in all her endeavors. Now that anchor was gone. She confided in friends that she missed him incessantly. She continued to sleep in their shared bedroom. Photographs adorned every surface. She spoke of him as if he was still very much present, and in a sense, for her, he always would be. Yet she did not fade away, which was something that surprised many. Segment 4. Keeper of the Flame, the Final Decade. For Nancy Reagan, grief did not equate to withdrawal. In the years following Ronald Reagan's passing, she became, as those close to her described, the keeper of the flame, the most devoted guardian of his memory and legacy. She immersed herself in the work of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley with an intensity that impressed even those who had known her for decades. She attended anniversary events. She welcomed guests. She met with scholars, politicians, and international leaders who came to offer their condolences. In 2005, she was honored at a gala in Washington, with attendees ranging from Dick Cheney to Condoleezza Rice to Harry Reid, a bipartisan assembly that reflected the evolution of her public perception in her later years. In 2007, she attended the funeral of Gerald Ford. In 2011, she presided over the ceremony commemorating Ronald Reagan's 100th birthday. She also hosted not one, but two Republican presidential primary debates at the Reagan Library in May 2007 and January 2008. She was in her mid to late 80s at this time, yet she continued to be present. Her advocacy for stem cell research also persisted. She had not abandoned the cause. While she was no longer fighting specifically for Ronnie, as that battle had concluded, she continued to champion the cause, lending her name and presence to it. She understood that any momentum she had generated could potentially aid families navigating similar experiences. Those who spent time with her during this period frequently remarked on something that surprised them. For years, she had been characterized as brittle, imperious, controlling, a woman who easily made adversaries and harbored resentments for extended periods. While some of that was undoubtedly true, in these final years, her sharper edges seemed to soften. Or perhaps it was simply that the protective armor she had always worn in public, the composed performance of a first lady, had become unnecessary. There was nothing left to safeguard in the manner she once had. She spoke more openly about her solitude, about the profound impact of structuring one's entire existence around another person, only to find oneself without them. She discussed the strangeness of attending events where people still treated her as if she were half of a pair, when she was now entirely alone. Her health, meanwhile, began to bear the strain of all she had endured. Segment 3. The body keeps the score. Health declines and falls. Nancy Reagan had always been petite. During her White House tenure, she was often described as slender to the point of appearing delicate. By her 80s, she had become genuinely frail. She had battled breast cancer during her White House years, undergoing a mastectomy in 1987, at a time when the subject was still heavily stigmatized. She had been forthright about her diagnosis, following the example of Betty Ford, who had spoken openly about her own breast cancer diagnosis a decade earlier. Nancy's candor at the time was widely regarded as a significant act of public service, and her willingness to discuss it helped bring the issue into mainstream discourse. However, by her late 80s and into her 90s, more serious health concerns began to emerge. She experienced a series of falls at her home in Bel Air, resulting in broken bones. Each fall, each fracture, and each recovery served as a stark reminder of how much had changed since the days when she had navigated the White House corridors with the assuredness of someone who knew precisely where she was headed. The falls were largely kept private. Nancy did not wish to be perceived as diminished. She still felt she had work to do. Her last major television interview was for a PBS documentary in 2010, conducted by anchor Judy Woodruff. She spoke about her husband, about the library, and about their shared life. She was sharp, precise, and still unmistakably Nancy Reagan. However, public appearances became increasingly infrequent. The woman who had hosted 56 state dinners, who had meticulously organized a week-long state funeral, and who had addressed the United Nations, was spending more and more time in the Bel Air home that held all the memories she had left. Friends visited. Her daughter, Patty, whose relationship with her mother had been strained for years due to public disagreements aired in books and interviews, had gradually moved towards reconciliation. They were never going to see eye to eye on every issue, nor were they going to pretend the difficult years had not occurred. Yet there was a gradual drawing together that those around them found deeply moving, and given their history, quite remarkable. Her son, Ron, also remained close. Her stepson, Michael, who had his own complex history with the family, had publicly expressed affection for her in the years following Ronald Reagan's death. It was not a perfect family. It had never been a perfect family. Nancy had never claimed otherwise. But in these final years, it was a family that was present. The Bel Air home became her world in these last months, a small world, but entirely hers. Segment 2. The morning it ended. On the morning of Sunday, March 6, 2016, Nancy Reagan passed away at her home in Bel Air. The cause was congestive heart failure. She was 94 years old. The announcement was made by the Reagan Foundation through her spokeswoman, Joanne Drake. Within hours, tributes began to pour in from across the globe. From presidents, former presidents, international leaders, and from people who had adored her, as well as those who had spent decades criticizing her. President Barack Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama released a statement expressing their profound sorrow. Former President George W. Bush described her as fiercely loyal to the nation she had served. Barbara Bush remarked that Nancy had been completely devoted to her beloved husband and that she and George found solace in the belief that they would be reunited. Arnold Schwarzenegger wrote that she had served with unbelievable strength, class, and grace. Her stepson Michael wrote something simpler and more direct. She was once again with the man she loved. On March 11, 2016, 5 days after her death, Nancy Reagan was laid to rest at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California. The funeral was attended by 10 former First Families. Former President George W. Bush was present. Michelle Obama represented the current administration. Former First Ladies Laura Bush and Rosalind Carter were in attendance. Hillary Clinton, then campaigning for the Democratic presidential nomination, also attended. Presidential children Caroline Kennedy and Tricia Nixon Cox were among the mourners. She was interred beside Ronald Reagan on the hillside at the library, overlooking the Santa Susana Mountains and the valley below. He had once told his biographer, Edmund Morris, that when the time came, they would seal the door temporarily until she joined him, and then they would lie there, just the two of them, and gaze out at the sea together. She was 94 years old. He had passed away at 93. Between them, they had lived almost 2 full centuries, and now it was complete. Segment 1. What she paid. Legacy of a complicated woman. The question of how to comprehend Nancy Reagan, who she was, what she accomplished, what she cost, and what she contributed, does not yield easy answers. It never has. She arrived in Washington as a Hollywood actress with a reputation for glamour and an unwavering, all-consuming devotion to her husband. She departed 8 years later as one of the most influential and least understood First Ladies in American history. Not because she wielded formal power, a claim she never made, but because she understood that proximity to power, wielded judiciously, was a form of power in itself. She had been instrumental in the dismissal of a chief of staff. She had lobbied foreign policy advisors. For years, she had subtly influenced the president's schedule through channels unknown to most of the nation. By most credible accounts, she had gently steered her husband towards engaging with the Soviet Union at a time when more hawkish elements within the administration opposed such overtures. And irrespective of one's views on astrology or motivations, those negotiations ultimately led to the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987 and contributed to the conclusion of a Cold War that had defined her entire adult life. She was also vain, protective, and at times ruthless. She had engaged in public disputes, held grudges, and was willing to use the press as a weapon when it suited her purposes. She was not a saint. She would have been the first to readily admit that. Her relationships with her own children were ample proof of this. Patty Davis had spent years not only estranged from her parents, but actively chronicling the distance between them in a novel, a memoir, and through public interviews. The rift had been agonizing for everyone involved. Michael Reagan, Ronald's adopted son from his first marriage, had his own complex history with the family, shaped by a challenging early life that had little direct connection to Nancy, but nonetheless cast shadows over their relationships. Ron Reagan Jr. had diverged from the conservative political ideology embodied by his parents. Even at the zenith of her influence in the White House, Nancy Reagan had not managed to maintain familial cohesion in the way a First Lady's public image often suggests. That chasm between the public persona and the private reality was a burden she carried. Yet she had also sat beside a man who no longer recognized her name, holding his hand daily for years. She had spearheaded a public health initiative focused on the disease that was claiming him. She had spoken candidly about breast cancer at a time when women were expected to endure such challenges in private. She had spent her 80s alone, widowed and physically frail, yet still actively engaged in protecting a legacy that was no longer in danger of being forgotten. Power, for Nancy Reagan, was never solely political. It was personal. It was the capacity to safeguard what she cherished most. And that cherished entity, Ronnie, always Ronnie, had been gone for 12 years by the time she passed away. She dedicated those 12 years to ensuring the world would not forget him. That was the price she paid, and it was also the choice she made. She once stated quite plainly that her life began when she married Ronald Reagan. Many found such a declaration difficult to comprehend. A brilliant, capable woman defining her entire identity in relation to another person. However, she was not being self-deprecating. She was being precise. According to her own assessment, that was the truth of her existence. And she never apologized for it. Not even once, not even at the very end. The woman depicted in that photograph outside the Capitol, standing alone beside the casket, her expression conveying a world gone silent, knew exactly who she was. She had always known. It had simply cost her everything to remain that way.